The original Lord of the Rings is a masterpiece. And it starts as a masterpiece. A writer who's writing about Judeo-Christian morality and Western civilization.
And I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings, actually, but it's because I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings that I'm not going to watch Amazon's version of it.
So last week I made a video talking about why just like the worst people like franchises and book series like the Dune books, and we mainly focused on Elon Musk, but we also focused on the different interpretations of the Dune book in contrast with Frank Herbert's own conservative libertarian politics. And yeah, go check that out if you're interested. I did say in that video that I would do a Lord of the Rings video. Now, I have actually done a fair few Lord of the Rings videos talking about Lord of the Rings and fascism. And with Dune, you don't find as large a fascist fan base as you do with Lord of the Rings, and it's actually long been a favourite of fascists because of basically the world it presents being quite a nice canvas for basically whatever politics you want to put on it, but also because of Tolkien's own traditionalism, his own Catholic faith, and just how that was compatible with more like traditionalist fascists like Julius Evola. And that's why the current Prime Minister of Italy actually loves Lord of the Rings as well, because they view the world through this fascist interpretation of Lord of the Rings. But also don't worry, it's not just Mediterranean Europe, it's also Silicon Valley as well, and loads of people from Elon Musk to recently JD Vance, they all love Lord of the Rings as well. And Ben Shapiro loves Lord of the Rings, and all the worst people you have ever seen in your life like Lord of the Rings, and I want to use this video to talk about why. And I grew up as someone who myself loved Lord of the Rings, and I'll talk about that in a sec. And yeah, it's perfectly fine to love Lord of the Rings. I guess as I get older, I do find it, I wouldn't call it a red flag, but if your favourite movies are still Lord of the Rings, I don't think we're going to be friends, is all I'm going to say, because as I get older, I find the pure fantasy and the black and white relative morality of Lord of the Rings like really, really boring and unappealing, but at the same time, it was created as escapism, like Tolkien's own words. He wanted to create this escapist fantasy. And in that, I understand why so many people do like losing themselves into this world. But yeah, as someone who loves stuff that's more morally grey, politics, religion, and maybe saying something about the real world, I just prefer something like Dune now. And obviously, I've read Dune more recently, but I think I just prefer it as just, you know, an IP at this point. We're going to talk about all of that today. Please follow me on social media if you haven't, and also check out my Patreon page. Want to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible. Benefits include getting access to videos early and ad-free, and also getting access to the private patrons Discord server. And with all of that out the way, let's get into the video. So this video is going to talk about a lot of the worst people you know like in Lord of the Rings, but let's talk about one of the best people you know like in Lord of the Rings. So I myself grew up at like a Lord of the Rings fanatic as a kid. Like, you know how so many people love Harry Potter, which I kind of liked as well. I love Lord of the Rings so much, and I was the perfect age for both of these like franchises. I was born in 1995. I was a very young kid when The Philosopher's Stone and Fellowship of the Ring came out. I remember there was always like fan wars about what was the better, you know, series. And yeah, I did like both. I saw all the Harry Potters in the cinema, but I actually didn't see the Lord of the Rings in the cinema. I think because my parents wouldn't take me. And I actually remember watching it on video around one of my cousin's house and seeing like the Moria scene and orcs getting like shot in the head with bows, and it actually kind of traumatized me as like a young like 5 or 6 year old. But by the time The Return of the King came out, I remember getting it on DVD. I was just so obsessed. Like, I watched that movie so many times, watched all the behind the scenes stuff. I used to tell people after watching this as like an 8-year-old that I wanted to be a director. Like, I just thought it looked so cool. and then played all the video games. I read all the books. I basically read anything that Tolkien put out that was set in the Lord of the Rings world. And even though a lot of that probably didn't make sense to me, I did love The Hobbit especially, loved the Hobbit game. And yeah, I was just obsessed as a kid. I absolutely loved this. And I've always loved history from a very young age. And I just love Lord of the Rings as like an extension of that. Like when I got taken around like these Viking museums in Ireland, I'd always be like, oh my God, it looks like the Lord of the Rings, like not really understanding the connection there. And I'd ask my dad, like, oh, is Lord of the Rings, as a kid, is Lord of the Rings real? And he's like, oh, it's inspired by like real things like World War I and Anglo-Saxon history. So yeah, like, you know, as a kid, love this stuff. And I even did like the Hobbit movies. I've never watched them again, but I did enjoy seeing the first two in particular in the cinema. I really hated the third one, especially the way the battle was done, which I was so excited to see as someone who'd always loved the Hobbit book. I really wanted to see that on the big screen. And it was just so disappointing. It just looked so stupid, like these massive worm things. I don't know, like not a massive hit by Peter Jackson there. And as a kid, Lord of the Rings is so appealing. The adventure, the very easy to understand morality of the world, like it's not very complex. All the heroes are just such good people. And most of like the races and stuff, they have like maybe some bad people. There's bad humans, there's bad hobbits, but their bad traits aren't really that severe, so you never really hate them. I guess with the humans, you do get the dark factions and stuff, who I always thought looked fucking cool. So I always wanted to like read stuff about the Easterlings and stuff. As it was intended, as a child, it was just such a nice escape. Like I just absolutely loved this world. But as I got older and older, it just bored me more and more. Like, I haven't watched the Lord of the Rings movies. I don't think I've watched them in, like, maybe 12 years or something. I don't remember watching them as an adult, but just the whole world became so unappealing. And I guess that happens to a lot of people. Like, as you hit adulthood, you're just looking for something more complex, something that kind of fits in with your developing political brain and stuff. So I love The Witcher, right? And I'd never, ever read The Witcher. I'd never played The Witcher. 2015, first year of university, play The Witcher 3, quickly becomes my favourite game of all time, and it still is today. And it's just something about The Witcher took my love of fantasy and gave me this world that kind of resembled our own in many ways and dealt with many problems we have. And when you read about like the politics of The Witcher, what it's a response to, like Polish nationalism, the glorification of Poland's past, the glorification of the Polish Catholic Church, and it just becomes so interesting, where with Tolkien's work, it's all about a glorification of a past that didn't exist, that he kind of did believe exists. And we're going to talk about that a bit later with the politics of this. So yeah, and now I'm older, reading stuff like Dune, Lord of the Rings has just lost all appeal to me. And I want to pitch my video game to like Warner Brothers. And this is how much I really have stopped giving a shit about the source material. I would love an open world Middle-earth video game set 300 years after the Return of the King, where you play as like a Uruk-hai mercenary who's like grown up in an Uruk-hai tribe, like surviving Uruk-hai tribe. This never happens in the books, by the way. There's no like surviving Uruk-hai. But I just found the whole concept of like dealing with race realism in terms of the Lord of the Rings. Like the Uruk-hai are just bad because they're born bad. And the whole religious aspect of, you know, Saruman being their god and kind of putting a more like modern, morally grey spin on the Lord of the Rings games. Like I just want this game to exist. And I know all the Tolkien, like, lore nerds would hate that, but come on, we had sexy Shelob in Shadow of War, the sequel to Shadow of Mordor, so can we not get an Uruk-hai-centered open-world Lord of the Rings game? It's never going to happen, but I thought it sounded cool. Now, before we talk about, like, the contemporary figures who love Lord of the Rings, we have to talk about the politics of Lord of the Rings itself, because Tolkien actually got annoyed in his lifetime because lots of socialists would message him asking him if like Lord of the Rings was a socialist body of work. And of course it wasn't. But also there's a mythology now about Tolkien being some sort of liberal anti-racist. In fact, I'm pretty sure like his estate have said stuff about this, because Tolkien explicitly didn't like the Nazis and stuff. But also Tolkien was no leftist. Tolkien was no liberal. He was a conservative Catholic anti-communist. And Tolkien supported Franco in the Spanish Civil War, which went against a lot of the academics and also the authors in England at the time who supported the Republican cause. And also you have to remember, Tolkien originally wrote The Lord of the Rings in a way that was meant to connect to actual English history. Like, it was meant to be this mythology that was then going to be passed down to like actual historical Anglo-Saxon figures who would then like conquer England and stuff, because he was so obsessed with Anglo-Saxon England, which he thought was like the real England, and he hated French and he hated France because of the Norman conquest that started in like 1066, and he never forgave them. This is a guy who was alive in the 1960s writing these books, and he couldn't forgive the French for something the Normans did to England to this day, because he believed the Anglo-Saxon traditionalist past, that was the best thing that happened to England, and the Normans robbed the English people of this amazing society that would have developed into something even better than what England became in the first place. Like, you have to keep that in mind when you read Lord of the Rings. This guy truly did believe like Anglo-Saxon civilization was some sort of pinnacle of English history. And it's such a funny way to look at English history as well, considering the Anglo-Saxons, which is a funny term anyway, that they're not like native Britons. They come in 400 AD in like a massive migration to help the English fight like the Irish and the Scottish and stuff. So there's like thousands and thousands of years of English history which has no relation to these Germanic settlers and conquerors. But Tolkien was still butthurt about that, you know, centuries and centuries on. And you have to remember, Tolkien grew up in a time in the British Empire, first in South Africa, then in England, where Anglo-Saxon as a racial identity was an absolutely massive thing. And you Americans might have heard this in terms of like, you know, the WASPs in America, Great Gatsby focuses on this. People in America who descended from Germanic peoples or England, they viewed themselves as Anglo-Saxons. And also some of the founding fathers in America also called themselves Anglo-Saxons and thought about their colonization of other parts of America in the way the Anglo-Saxons colonized places like England. People at the time believed the Anglo-Saxon race, Northern Germanic peoples and English peoples, it was basically, you were the superior white people, not like those old Irish, not like those Spanish who were owned by Arabs for so many hundreds of years. No, we are carrying the pure legacy of Anglo-Saxon England, which was held up as like this actual golden age. And this was propaganda that started in England dating back to like Henry VIII and stuff. So we have to remember this all in context. Tolkien really hated industrialization. Tolkien hated urbanization. And if there's one strong political message in The Lord of the Rings, it's the end of Return of the King, where the hobbits all return to the Shire being industrialized by men, and then they all fight this massive battle against the men to get rid of them, right? It's very clearly Tolkien's own politics at play there. So when you have all of that, and you have the more like binary good versus evil storytelling of this fantasy world, you can see how compatible Tolkien's work is with a fascist interpretation, in a way something like the Dune books aren't, especially from a Eurocentric like fascist position, because most of the good peoples in The Lord of the Rings are all inspired by European groups like Anglo-Saxons, Scandinavians, and a lot of inspiration for the bad guys, you know, the humans who worship Sauron, orcs, Uruk-hai, come from like Eastern peoples as well, like groups like the Mongols. And also, as one of like the founders of modern fantasy, something Tolkien also did was mainstream like race realism in the fantasy genre, because yeah, like nearly every single white English person or white South African at the time, Tolkien did believe in race realism, is that different races had intrinsic qualities, good and bad. And yes, lots of people at the time, of course, believed the Anglo-Saxon race of white men had the intrinsic qualities of intelligence, while plenty of colonized people around the British Empire had the intrinsic quality of like brute strength, but they were pretty simple-minded. And that's the way people like Tolkien viewed the world, which was very common for the time. And that's reflected in his fantasy work, which has had an absolutely like massive impact, where so much fantasy just has like actual evil races of people where they're just born evil. And there's no questioning of that in the fantasy, and there's loads of people born just like purely good. And as you get older, you not only realize the problems of that, it's also fundamentally very boring. But again, it's also a canvas to project what you want on it. So let's now talk about the history of fascism and The Lord of the Rings before we talk about the modern fascists who love it. So you guys might have seen this recently, because I've seen this reference in a lot of the JD Vance coverage, and that is basically the current Italian Prime Minister, who has been talking about Lord of the Rings. So just an article by The Guardian before we read something more substantial about the history. So Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, will personally open a new exhibition about the Lord of the Rings author J.R.R. Tolkien at Rome's National Gallery of Modern and Contemporary Art on Wednesday, highlighting her far-right government's growing interest in shaping the output of the country's cultural institutions. The exhibition, which, according to La Repubblica, is being funded by Italy's culture ministry to the tune of €250,000. In her 2021 autobiography, Political Manifesto, PM Giorgia Meloni described Tolkien's 1954 fantasy epic as a sacred text. As a youth activist in the post-fascist Italian social movement, Meloni had visited schools dressed as a hobbit, and in 2008 she was photographed next to a sculpture of Gandalf. She also said, "I don't consider The Lord of the Rings to be a fantasy." And when she was a youth activist, she also attended Hobbit Camp, a woodland retreat where the future stars of Italy's alt-right political scene would dress up as the Lord of the Rings figures. Now, I've actually spoke about this a lot in the past, so if you have been subscribed to me for over 2 years at this point, you might have heard some of this before, but I thought I should read it again for this video. So, Tobias Hoff from Fair Observer, of Hobbits and Tigers, the unlikely heroes of Italy's radical right. So it basically just talks about the fascist movements of the 70s and 80s and how they use Lord of the Rings to both draw people in, but kind of as like a jumping off point to more traditionalist fascist texts. So Julius Evola is, of course, probably the most famous traditionalist fascist. People who haven't heard of this guy, he was friends with like the most prominent fascists in Italy and Germany. He did meet with people like Mussolini and Hitler as well. And how he's different to them is, you see with Mussolini and Hitler, they were all happy for like industrialization, a very centralized state controlling these things, and urbanization. They were people who believed that was key to the fascist power base and that was key to fascist control. People like Evola are more traditionalists in that they want to return to a traditional agrarian society. And you can see a lot easier how that can be interpreted as more of an anti-capitalist fascist thing, because a lot of these people believe capitalism is actually something the Jews invented to keep people enslaved to money, and also something they invented to crowd people into urban centers and deprive them from freedom and basically just make them slaves to, I don't know, Jewish capitalists or something like that. So going back to a more like idealized rural past is just better in general. It allows you to free yourself from the control of other bad groups of people in their view. And that is how he contrasted with them. But that's why when you see something like The Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien is saying, yeah, like, the future is bad, let's go back to this idealized past. And Tolkien obviously lived in a place that was very traditional, very rural. So it's something he absolutely loved, just like a lot of these fascists. So just keep in mind when I read you part of this article. So Middle-earth in Italy. So the scope of this iteration of Italy's new right was first demonstrated at Campo Hobbit Festival, June 1977, which was organised by Tarchi's Youth Front and named after Tolkien's fantasy novel, The Hobbit. Despite the party's leadership opposition, the festival drew over 3,000 people and imbued the younger right-wing extremists with a new feeling of strength towards a hostile society. Concrete political objectives were rejected and replaced by abstract values such as courage, heroism, and above all, comradeship. For the festival organisers and attendants, Tolkien's fantasy novels served as a metaphor for their rejection of the modern world and their longing for a future that was better than any historical allegory. They perceive themselves as the heroes of Tolkien's imagined Middle-earth, fighting against all odds for the betterment of the contemporary world. As Generoso Simeoni, one of the organisers, stated, "Looking to the future, let us evoke from Tolkien's fairy tales those images that enrich our imagination. We are inhabitants of the mythical Middle-earth, also struggling with dragons, orcs, and other creatures." To express their attachment to Tolkien's stories, which were deeply rooted in Germanic and Old English legends, the Celtic cross became the new symbol of the Youth Front. While festival goers were able to purchase a variety of books, including those written by Evola, the musical performances were the real attraction, given that music was considered the most important and efficient form of expression in right-wing counterculture. Hobbit camps, which took place in 1977, 78, 80, and 81, also featured theatre, poetry, and cabaret shows. There was also debates about ecology, health, and housing. By including these traditionally leftist topics, the organisers intended to attract the leftist youth and start a dialogue with their former enemies. Through their engagement and willingness to incorporate these themes and types of events, they sought to break out of cultural and social marginalisation. So talking about Evola a bit more, he died in 1974, but became a guru-like figure for the radical youth looking for guidance while lost in the mythical lands of Middle-earth. Evola had never joined a political party. He called Mussolini's 1922 March on Rome a caricature of revolution and rejected the Italian fascist regime as too populistic and devoid of any spirituality. Evola's use of myth mirrored Tolkien's saga of Middle-earth with its eternal fight between good and evil. The similarity between Evola's philosophy and Tolkien's novels, which enjoyed immense mainstream popularity, ultimately increased the appeal of Evola's work among a younger generation of radicals who were in desperate need of a system of cultural references untouched by historical fascism. On the surface, Evola and Tolkien shared another worldview, anti-modernism. It is Evola's concept of anti-modernism that the fascists found particularly useful when justifying acts of violence. In his book Revolt Against the Modern World, Evola argues that history was not an evolutionary success story, but a devolution from an imagined spiritual and traditional culture to the modern world. While he praises the Knights Templar and the SS for their efforts to stop further decline into anarchy, he characterises the Renaissance, the liberal ideas of the French Revolution, and Italy's post-war economic miracle as false myths leading the world into chaos. Moreover, he claims that modernity could never gradually transition into what he considered the traditional order. The only way to establish this order, which according to him was outside history, was the total destruction of the modern world. Tolkien's own popularity among the right-wing youth who felt marginalised in their own country symbolised a deep dissatisfaction with the modern world that was more rooted in a generational conflict than a specific political ideology. Given the many thematic overlaps between Tolkien and Evola's philosophy, it was a small step for some radicals to accept Evola's writings as applicable facts and use them to legitimise their violence. So like I was saying, because of Tolkien's more like basic binary morality in The Lord of the Rings, good versus evil is a clear theme. It is easy for anyone to project, their own views on it. Like, even if we take the scouring of the Shire, for example, in The Return of the King, you could characterize that as, capitalists just not caring about the environment, right? And the Hobbits are collectively standing up together as maybe this sort of socialist group fighting back against capitalism, right? And that's why so many people viewed it through a leftist lens. But then if you look at Tolkien's own views and you compare that to someone like Julius Evola and how much they both hated the modern world, it's far more compatible with that reading, and it'd probably be a more accurate reading to show, because Tolkien was characterized by his traditionalism and his Catholic faith, right? So he had the spirituality as well, just like Evola wanted. So you can see how, a fascist group in Italy during a certain time would latch onto Lord of the Rings, and then today the Prime Minister was a product of that environment, and she also loves this worldview, because you can make the bad guys in Lord of the Rings a symbol for anyone. And fascists will, of course, make it a symbol could be for Italy now, for Muslims, could be for Jews in general, or just any group people don't like. And even if you're Julius Evola, if you were reading Lord of the Rings, you could depict something like the scouring of the Shire, of even fascist infighting, of here is Mussolini coming to develop Italy into whatever, and he doesn't care about the environment or spirituality or anything like that. So that is just the context of how Lord of the Rings has always appealed to fascists. And as we're moving on to the tech bros of Silicon Valley who also love this, beyond the politicians who love this, I also think, and this might be a spicy take, I think most people should kind of grow out of Lord of the Rings. And I posted this on Twitter the other day with some backlash. I'm not saying Lord of the Rings isn't a good movie trilogy, because it's a great one, right? Based on the practicality of it and how it still holds up today, they are great movies. I'm not denying that. And as books, I haven't read them in many, many years, but I really liked them as a kid as well. But I just feel still thinking Lord of the Rings are the best movies ever. I just, for me, like I said at the start of the video, it's a bit of a red flag, and I just don't think we're going to be friends, because I think if you think about things on a more complex level and just don't want to delude yourself with fantasy and escapism, I just don't think you'd like Lord of the Rings. And I feel part of the reason all the worst people like Lord of the Rings is it's so easy to understand, and you don't have to have any critical thinking. We were talking about Elon Musk in the last video, not understanding Dune, and fascist interpretation of Dune not making any sense. But they both make sense for Lord of the Rings, and also you don't really have to think critically about the story here because it's all very basic surface level stuff. And Tolkien talking about how he wanted to make like this Anglo-Saxon mythology, like Greek mythology or something, it's even more boring than that in my opinion, because Greek mythology is interesting because the gods are so flawed and they so reflect human nature, where nearly everyone in Lord of the Rings really doesn't reflect what humans are actually like. They are caricatures of pure good or pure evil. And like I said, as I've gotten older, that is not interesting to me at all. And I know people hate the Rings of Power. That was more interesting to me because it actually delved into, oh yeah, not all peoples really like get along all the time, and there is more complexity there. Just showing a little bit of animosity between dwarves and elves sometimes, it's not enough for me personally. And I feel like people like Elon, JD Vance, they're just like nerds who love this stuff because it's just not challenging, and you can project your worldview onto it. And also you can self-insert yourself in any of the characters if you want, because you kind of want to be all the characters because they are just such perfect people who are very skilled. I mean, if we're going to get into the real fashy shit, of course, kind of like Dune has a cynical take on bloodlines, Lord of the Rings doesn't have a cynical take on bloodlines. It's just like, oh yeah, Aragorn is like the best because he's the product of two like really superior like bloodlines, so he should be the king. Kind of like an endorsement of the right of kings, it feels like. But let's talk about this a bit more. So an article by Salvador Rodriguez, Why Silicon Valley is Obsessed with Lord of the Rings. As San Francisco marketing tech startup 5-Star struggled to raise money in late 2015, Matt Curl, Senior Vice President of Business Operations, gave his deputies free books as assigned reading to inspire them and keep them from despair. The free books were The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and Return of the King. Curl said they are profound human truths that were written in those books. I'll reference Lord of the Rings things a lot, and I want them to understand what I'm saying. Curl is among a broad swath of executives in Silicon Valley who are avid fans of the Lord of the Rings. These techies use the fantasy world dreamed up by Tolkien as a common ground, a shared passion they can reference to communicate with and relate to one another. Facebook's vice president of AR/VR, Andrew Bosworth, for example, referenced the Elf Queen Galadriel in a leaked memo to his employees that was published in the New York Times. It wasn't his first reference either. He is credited with nicknaming Mark Zuckerberg's infamous silent stares as Sauron's gaze. The gaze has been used as an inspiration for video imagery used atop Salesforce Tower, which is the tallest skyscraper in Silicon Valley and has been lit up in bright orange as the Eye of Sauron on the past two Halloweens. Famed venture capitalist Peter Thiel, meanwhile, has named companies after objects in Lord of the Rings. This includes data analytics startup Palantir Technologies, a reference to the spherical stones in Lord of the Rings that would allow characters to see in other parts of the world. It also includes venture firm Mithril Capital, which is named after, obviously, the lightweight metal. Palmer Luckey, co-founder of Oculus VR, took a similar approach when he named his defense startup Anduril Industries, which is named after the sword used by Aragorn. Earl said, when you see conference rooms or companies named after Lord of the Rings, what they're saying is, this profoundly affected my life and profoundly affected the way I think about things. And I think there's a desire for more people to read it and to understand it. Lord of the Rings is also a big deal for Alex Farr, the CEO of Zamu, a startup whose service enables clients to build apps for voice assistants. He has named his cars, do people name their cars? After the elf warrior Legolas, and he named his horse after Gandalf. He refers to his home in Marin County as the Shire. It's just a great story. It's just a beautiful story of which direction your life can go. For Alan Cohen, partner at venture firm DCVC, Lord of the Rings has been present throughout his tech career. His partner Matt Ocko, for example, is known for going around the office impersonating Gollum. This sounds so fucking stupid. At his first board meeting with Kentic, a networking startup, Cohen wore a black shirt that read, "One does not simply telnet in Mordor," a meme referencing both networking protocol and a famous Lord of the Rings line about the land of the villain Sauron. They just smiled and got it immediately. It made them understand that we're on the same plane. Andy Ellis, the chief security officer at Akami Technologies, says about the line, "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you," which Sam says to Frodo. "To me, that's a true hero," said Ellis, who can recite the inscription written on the One Ring in Tengwa, a script in Lord of the Rings that was created by Tolkien. We don't celebrate people who get up every day and do the work that needs to be done and support somebody else. So for a lot of this video, I've been talking about like projecting your own personal political views on the world of Lord of the Rings. How much would Tolkien himself absolutely despise the people projecting not their political views, projecting their job in the tech industry and comparing themselves to like Frodo and Sam? He would be absolutely horrified by these people. But again, you see why to me it's such a red flag when people are super into Lord of the Rings. Is like, what is fucking interesting about this anymore when you're an adult, right? Apart from an interesting like fantasy world with lore and escapism, like actually having it influence your worldview is absolutely fucking insane. It's just like the most bog standard good versus evil stuff. And yeah, maybe you can project your own worldview, but these people are just such nerds and they never grow out of it as well. And it says so much their morality can be boiled down to like good versus evil, where they see themselves as the good guys, destroying the One Ring while making like surveillance technology for like, I don't know, the IDF and shit like that. Like, it's just so bizarre to me. And I know a few people in my own life who still love Lord of the Rings, and even some of my friends. And I'm just like, yeah, like I get it to a certain extent. At the same time, it's like, can you also grow up a little bit as well? Like for most people who've only watched the movies, you seriously cannot have an interesting conversation about Lord of the Rings. Like what do you fucking talk about at this point? Like these movies are just fucking everywhere. They've been around for so long. And it's just like the original Star Wars films. At a certain point, they're just so surface level. There isn't really much to analyze beyond the craft of it if we're talking about the movies. That's my Kavernacle hot take for this video. But yeah, all these evil people in Silicon Valley being inspired by Lord of the Rings and all just loving it as the only media franchise they knew from like college because they're probably like 20 years old when they watch the movies. But yeah, it's probably like not surprising these people are also evil. Now, speaking of evil people, let's go on to JD Vance, because Politico actually done an article that was making the rounds where they just talked about like his own, love for Lord of the Rings. And it's significant because this guy could very well be the Vice President of the United States, who is just some fucking Lord of the Rings nerd from Silicon Valley as well. So Vance's most millennial trait is just how geeky he is about the Lord of the Rings. The trilogy of novels has been a long-standing nerd favourite for decades, but it's become the centre of culture during his high school years thanks to Peter Jackson's movies. Vance himself has pointed to Tolkien's high fantasy as a window into understanding his worldview. In an archived episode of the defunct Grounded podcast from 2021, Rep. Jim Banks of Indiana, who sat next to Vance in Trump's Friends and Family box at the convention Tuesday, asked him to name his favourite author. I would say it would have to be Tolkien. I'm a big Lord of the Rings guy, and I think not realising it at the time, but a lot of my conservative worldview was influenced by him growing up. He added of Tolkien's colleague, big fan of C.S. Lewis, really sort of like that era of English writers. I think they were really interesting. They were grappling in part because of World War II with just very big problems. I don't know if he misspoke on that. Like, yeah, obviously, like, World War II influenced, like, many people. They wrote their books in the post-war era. But both, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien both fought in the First World War, which you probably think would have more of an impact on their writing since they were actually, like, in that war. At the same time, I like the Narnia books as a child. They're children's books. Like, Lord of the Rings especially, you can argue if they're books for children or not. The Hobbit is a book for children. All the Narnia books get very strange, but the way they're written clearly has a younger audience in mind, in my opinion, as someone who loved those books too. And Lord of the Rings is also largely for a younger audience as well. The only thing of Lord of the Rings, I would say the actual craft of it is far more like intellectual and academic than the Narnia books, which is mainly about like, the Christian faith and stuff like that. But yeah, no 40-year-old politician trying to be like the second most powerful person in the world should like love the Narnia books. I just think that's such a poor reflection on you as an adult and as someone who consumes anything at all. Like, you don't just like that generation of English writers, you like the two guys who are friends who both wrote fantasy books at the same time, which people associate with each other. So the venture capital firm he founded in 2019 is named Narnia, named after one of the other rings that Gandalf wears. Obviously talks about his mentor, Peter Thiel, and everything we spoke about so far. The rest of the article just goes on to like interview like various people about why like these people love Lord of the Rings so much. But yeah, that's how it links to today's politics. One of the guys who wants to be vice president and maybe president one day if all things go well for him, which I don't think they will. But yeah, he bases his worldview on Lord of the Rings, and he also loves the Narnia books. And he also converted to Catholicism, I think, recently in the last 5 years. And he's a bit of a fundamentalist when it comes to that stuff. And as someone who's raised Catholic, it seems to always be the Catholic converts which are way more fanatical about the religion than people who were raised in it. And Tolkien himself didn't strike me as a fanatic, even in his work. Obviously, Tolkien himself was a very strong believer in Catholicism. I mean, it's why he supported Franco in the Spanish Civil War. But now I hope you see why Lord of the Rings is such like a ripe world for far-right conservatives to absolutely love, mainly because it was constructed as an escapist fantasy. It was constructed to start with as a mythology for a past in England that was already highly praised and idealized by white supremacists in England during Tolkien's lifetime. And then you fast forward to the 70s and 80s, Italian fascists make it comparable with Julius Evola's work, and then you have the movies come out, skyrocket them into popularity in the 21st century. Now you have the people who were 20 when these movies come out, all being like some of the most powerful people on the earth, and they're naming all these terrible things after stuff in Lord of the Rings and basing their worldview on this, essentially a blank canvas. The world where there is good versus evil. There are races of people born bad, and there are heroes which we could all be like, and we can all maybe see ourselves in, because they really just don't resemble anything in real life. They are these perfect beings who do the best things, and they overcome massive odds to save the day. And yeah, a lot of religious people like Tolkien himself probably believe that one day God's going to come down and make things right. And he just believed that's an inevitability of human existence, that God will save the world and from evil. Obviously, when you view the world in such simplistic terms, believing in this fantasy yourself of religion, it's probably not surprising you write something like this, but so many religious types and religious conservatives grasp onto Lord of the Rings as some sort of deep message about life. Like I said, in terms of like the actual crafting of the world, Tolkien making up like languages and the way it's written, I all think that's very good. And like I said, academic in its own way, but politically, I just don't find Lord of the Rings interesting at all. And I actually think the Scouring of the Shire is probably the most interesting part of the whole book politically. But it's a part a lot of people don't even know about because it wasn't actually in the movies. Why, for me, as you get older, you just lose interest in this world. And that's why I know it's a bit of a joke, I said it, but making a video game where you take someone like an Uruk-hai who's born evil and you throw him into a post, Sauron world and post-Saruman world, and you're like, well, what does that look like for this person? I just find that so much more interesting than anything they're doing, because then, you have to reconcile, like, what does this world look like for someone who everyone sees as bad, just by them being perceived as bad by the race they were born in, right? I think that makes Lord of the Rings more interesting. I'll try and make peace with Tolkien fans. I will also say, Lord of the Rings never wanted to be this. Lord of the Rings never wanted to be The Witcher. Lord of the Rings never wanted to be Dune. Tolkien hated Dune. He wanted it to be this fantasy about good versus evil where good won. He wanted it to be simplistic in that way, and he wanted it to be an escape from reality. So I'm not criticizing his goal with this work because, yeah, if he wanted to make that and he did, he succeeded at it, and you can see that. But also because he didn't want to put the real world in his fantasy. You just get every single group across the political spectrum sticking their own politics into it because it is pretty much compatible with politics however you see it. But I would say, in my opinion, like how I said, Dune is very compatible with a libertarian reading, of course, because that's the author's own politics, but also there's lots in there that's compatible with a left-wing reading of it as well. I would say Lord of the Rings is far more compatible with a fascist interpretation than it is with a left-wing interpretation. So that's it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.